So, who am I? What am I talking about? This sounds far more complicated than it probably is going to be. I think this is a good introduction maybe to the show. So it's a little bit of a history lesson around how with cellular IoT we've gotten to this point where from my perspective as a kind of connectivity specialist, I find this stuff super confusing. So for the guys that are designing hardware and those kind of working with modules and customers ultimately of ours, I can't even begin to understand how complicated it must be for you guys and other people at the show. So a bit of a history lesson and a walk through how we've gotten to today, and then maybe try and give some guidance on how best to kind of navigate some of these kind of challenges that we're going to depict. My name's Toby. I work for Wireless Logic. So I'm a product manager, so I look after anything at Wireless Logic that's hosted on our own core network. My background is M&Os, so I think I started working in IoT around 2008. Background very much in packet gateways, HSSs, authentication, and kind of all the way around into kind of sales roles, support, SIM manufacturing, SIM procurement, all of those things. So I've kind of done it front to back, and I feel like I really kind of understand how all of this stuff holds together. Too far. So why is it confusing? So realistically, when IoT began, or machine to machine as it was called then, it was really just a happy accident. So at that time, you had cellular networks were up everywhere around the world, and they were totally designed for phones. So it's very much SMS, it's very much voice calls, a million miles away from where we are today, where everyone's texting on WhatsApp, everyone's looking at Facebook. It was a completely phone-dominated market, and there was very little else to it. So all of those things for M&Os, that's kind of 99-100% of all of the money that they're making is all based on people making phone calls and consumers. So these core networks have been built completely with that in mind. So more recently, you'll look at kind of 3GPP releases, and they're all around all of these weird and wonderful ways that IoT devices can connect to networks. But back then, it was very much all around Camel, prepaid, how you could build things on the fly. But all very, very much to do with telephones. At the time, the most that you would have as far as packet switching would be to have one of the phones at the time, kind of 2005, 2006. The most you do with data, with cellular data, would be to check an email or at most to kind of check the weather. You had advents of kind of GPRS into Edge, and you could select a WAP, APN, and you could basically just look at very, very basic pieces of data on the internet. So if we go to the end of the noughties, cast your mind back to 2010, and we'll try and look at what the market was like, or at least towards the end of the noughties. So 2010, I'm not even 30 at that point. My hair is thick and lush. I don't have any children. Life is easy. And the IoT market at the same time was similar to that. It wasn't particularly complicated. As far as SIM cards, the 2FF was the standard size. None of the phone companies had come out and kind of started shrinking down these things to save space on their boards. Data was super expensive. So a few megs of data would be included in your package and not much else. It wouldn't be kind of, gigs and gigs of data that you talk about today. And roaming was a completely different concept. So we talk about bill shock today, but bill shock back then, if you'd taken your phone by accident on holiday and burnt through a couple of hundred megs of data, then you'd be talking about remortgaging your house. I mean, it was crazy amounts of money that people would have to spend to roam data around the world. There were numbers like £10 a megabyte you'd see in AA14 agreements, which is totally crazy in today's market. And oddly, towards the end of the noughties, broadband had really matured, but cellular data hadn't. So you think about proper broadband existed in that time, but still cellular IoT was largely based on things like CSD, which I still find totally bizarre is still in the market. This whole concept that you can have a dial-up connection. I tried to explain it to one of my kids recently and was kind of trying to give them fax tones, and they were like, no, don't understand, doesn't make any sense. So M&Os at the time then weren't really thinking about roaming. Like I say, there was this kind of concept of bill shock, and no one really talked to each other, and it was really that M&Os were just competing for national consumers, within their own markets. So bear with me. I'll leave it there. So what was the market like in 2010? So towards the end of those 90s. So things had started to change. And one of the big drivers for that change, like we talked about before about the price of roaming at that point, one of the big drivers in change was this change in the consumer market. So you guys might have seen the recent BlackBerry film. So BlackBerry was super successful because they were looking at a data compression model, and they brought this concept of having email and having, your whole life on a device. But it was all still around kind of small amounts of data, and data rates and roaming rates were super, super high. In 2007, a clever guy called Steve Jobs came along and completely pivoted the market. So suddenly from that point, late 2007, 2008, the first Android handset hit the market. And by 2010, all of the app stores were live. Things like Facebook had really started to take off. Streaming services on phones had completely changed this dynamic around price. And all of the MNOs were then competing directly for this roaming market and also kind of competing locally. And everyone starts talking at that point around how much for a gig of data rather than how much for a meg of data. And that's a really important point at that area of time. A really important point as well with this is LTE launched in 2009. So you can see now all of these things that we're talking about, it's becoming kind of this kind of hotbed of where things are all moving on, not necessarily totally interrelated, but they're all affecting each other. If we step to the side and think more specifically about kind of the market that we guys are from, so what was happening in modules? I can see Simon from uBlocks in the crowd, so if I get my date wrong about uBlocks, he might give me a frown. But towards the end of the noughties, cellular modules themselves also started to mature in the market. So in 2010, the only real games in town were Telit and Sierra. So they had cellular modules in the region of around 3 million units globally in 2010, which isn't very much. Sierra had been around for about 10 years at that point and were just celebrating their millionth cellular module. So you think about those numbers, 3 million globally in 2010, not a million years ago, 14 years ago. And last year, the estimated number for cellular module sales globally is over 650 million. So you see in 14 years, I mean, we've seen hockey stick graphs around the industry before, but crazy, crazy growth, impressive. And then what does that mean for a salesperson? So my background is obviously connectivity, and I talk to a lot of people about, what we'd like to provide them in terms of connectivity. But in 2010, those sales conversations were so simple, honestly. Anyone could have done it. You'd just call someone up, or they would phone you, and you'd say, how many SIMs do you want? You knew it was going to be a 2FF SIM. How many megabytes of data do you want? And that was kind of it. It was all piggybacking on existing roaming agreements, and there wasn't really that much to consider across the market. I've neglected my slides. So life was easy. So what does it look like today? And I mean, this is the whole point, but it's become super complicated in what I think is quite a short period of time. Maybe 14 years isn't really a short period of time. But I think this will animate. So there's so much more to consider now. We look at form factors. We've gone from 2FF into 3FF into 4FF, MFF2, QFN8. We've got wafer level silicon that you can solder in. You've got iSIM. You've got lots of people will be talking about kind of the reinvention of soft SIM. We've got all of these new LTE technologies. We've got Cat1, we've got Cat-M, we've got narrowband. We've got all these concepts of power saving. We've got extended discontinuous reception. All of these things they sound amazing, and they are amazing, but they're confusing, and they're not all necessarily well brought together in the market. We've got different types of SIM now. We've got EUICC, we've got different types of eSIM. We've got SGP02, SGP22, SGP32, SGP42. All of this stuff is just layering on top, and some of it's interoperable and some of it isn't. We've now kind of come through this concept of original roaming where it was expensive, and then it wasn't expensive, and it was all kind of open and kind of not free, but everyone was getting along. The MNOs were just kind of letting people get on with it. And now we've got these concepts of permanent roaming. Everyone will be familiar with places like Brazil and Turkey where this stuff is just difficult. If you're a hardware designer or a solution engineer and you want to deploy something globally, it's a real head scratcher. Compared to 14 years ago, it's difficult. And if you truly want to have kind of a single stock keeping unit for the globe, this stuff is genuinely challenging. You've also layer on top of this things like device certification. You've got GCF, you've got PTCRB, you've got the likes of Verizon who have their own certification program. And that's fine in one market if you're just deploying in your home market, but that's not the reality. If you've got an IoT solution that you want to provide globally, then sure, you want to consider every single country in the world. So those kind of local deployments, they're not really on your radar. Now we're into 5G. You've got non-standalone, you've got standalone, you've got 5G Red Cap, which is kind of the buzz term at the moment. At the same time, we're kind of moving into that. But 5G standalone roaming doesn't even exist yet. But we're already talking about modules that are going to be using these technologies. And at the same time, MNOs just haven't really caught up with it. And then to finish, we've got things like VoLTE. We're talking about satellite, MEO, GEO, LEO. And then we've got kind of concepts of sunsetting and some of these technologies that are slowly coming off the market. So you as device designers or solutions designers, these are things that have to be navigated to be able to bring something to market and have some kind of confidence that they'll work in the market for kind of the amount of time you design the device to do so. Bear with me. And sorry, going back to that last one. So all of these different technologies, they sound amazing. And I think 3GPP and all of these boards that kind of talk about this stuff at length have done a fantastic job. But, you know, all of these LTE technologies, you'd kind of sit down as someone not involved with the industry and you'd say, oh, these things are great. These are available everywhere, right? All of this stuff will work in every single country and everyone's deployed the same stuff. And I can take my device to China or the USA or to Brazil or wherever I want, and it'll just work, right? But it's clearly not that easy. You have different geographies deploying different LTE bands. You've got the East adopting narrowband more readily than the West. You've got the West deploying now into things like Cat 1 Biz. There's considerations about whether some of these technologies will continue to exist. And yeah, to reiterate, it's super complex and super convoluted. So that's why all of this stuff's a bit messy. And I kind of blame the MNOs a little bit because I feel like people haven't been speaking readily enough. You've kind of got the device and module guys here. You've got the MNOs kind of on the other side. You've got ultimately customers in the middle. And there hasn't really been enough working together. And, you know, all of this stuff's been designed and rolled out in bits and pieces. And we've got to this point where it's super complicated. But at the same time, I would spare a moment to think about the MNOs. So a big challenge for MNOs today, and you guys may or may not be familiar with the concepts of kind of network outages driven by IoT, things like signaling storms. But the big challenge for MNOs today, and it will change over time, but a really big challenge for them is not only these new technologies. So I come from Jersey in the Channel Islands, and when we upgraded our network when I worked there years and years ago, we only had to update kind of 10 base stations. It's a super small place. But you think about the likes of EE or O2 in the UK, and I mean, the low power market in the UK is poor to say the least. But you think about that investment you have to put in to go and upgrade every single site. It's enormous. And then you have to try and think about how you monetize it, which is a massive challenge. But at the same time, these networks not only having to kind of consider the future or what 3GPP or whoever else is kind of rolling out the new standards, at the same time, they have to manage all of this legacy traffic. So whilst IoT was kind of maturing through the noughties and years after that, we've still got this huge legacy base of 2G and 3G devices. And I always use this slightly strange analogy when I'm trying to explain why networks go down. Wireless Logics doesn't go down. I'm talking about kind of stuff I've been involved in previously. But 2G, 3G signaling is very much like Rafa Nadal and someone like Novak Djokovic or Roger Federer at the French Open. It's many messages. When you go through kind of SI, send authentication, logging into the network, in 2G, 3G networks, that's somewhere around 25, 26, 27 messages back and forth. And that's just something that takes an instant, a split second. Whereas in LTE networks, it's more like 5 or 6 messages. So kind of always relate that to Pete Sampras at Wimbledon. It's a far more economical technology. But for MNOs managing kind of big legacy bases, they may only have a couple of 100,000 2G, 3G modules or kind of sensors on their network, but it's an enormous burden. And a lot of these 2G, 3G modules that existed kind of 10, 15 years ago don't behave particularly well on networks. They'll quite often reboot at the same time. And then you hear of the big MNOs around Europe having kind of outages and signaling storms. And you can kind of see where MNOs, considering what percentage of their turnover is all based on the consumer market, how the stuff we're doing irritates them and maybe doesn't make them want to invest in more of this technology. So these things will change over time, but the MNOs will struggle for the coming years, still trying to support this older stuff at the same time as trying to kind of keep up to date with all of this new stuff that we're talking about at shows like this, and the way that we would like their networks to work. But ultimately they're in charge of their own destiny as far as that's concerned. I am clicking, I promise. Maybe I'm too far away. I'll go old school. So this is just a depiction. I mean, we talked at the beginning about kind of 2-3 million modules around 2010, but just to re-illustrate kind of all of these different technologies we're bringing through and just the adoption. I mean, some of this is kind of forecast, but you just see that the huge volumes we're shipping now. Like I said, 2023, we're looking about 6 million cellular modules globally. But this stuff, it's great, and it means that we as kind of device designers and hardware guys and network guys all have more options. But still, all of these things, every single additional line is just an additional set of products. It's an additional rollout for a module vendor. It's an additional iteration of a product for a connectivity provider, for a solutions designer, and it's complicated. I mean, there is some hope here where, if we get to this point that 5G really kind of dominates the market and it is this kind of really network economical kind of perfect solution, that all of these things will kind of tail off and we'll eventually be able to rely on one type of technology. But still, we've got all of this. We still get calls at Wireless Logic from people who have circuit switch data devices in the network today, loads of them. And I feel bad because they, whoever installed those kind of 10 years ago, 15 years ago, they probably don't work at the company anymore. And those guys don't really realize that they have to go through this whole kind of evolution of devices, and they need to really think about how they move their products on. That's modules. So all I've done is moan. So when is this stuff going to get any easier? It should get easier, but it is going to take time and it will be slow. So we already kind of have seen this concept of 2G, 3G sunsets. I mean, that's painful, I guess, if people have got devices in the market that either rely on 2G or rely on 2G fallback. But another one's going to be around kind of these LTE technologies. So obviously we've got narrowband, we've got LTE-M. I've spoken to some MNOs globally, and there's talk already about people pulling one or other of the technology. So narrowband is generally the one people have mentioned, because the MNOs, even the largest MNOs with enormous inbound volumes of roamers and IoT devices, they just can't monetize it. In roaming, you'll put on a network might call you up and say, oh, now I have to charge you an access fee. So every month that you use narrowband on my network, I'm going to charge you 30 cents. But it completely murders the whole economics of the model. I mean, if you want to have a module that's running kind of quarter of a meg a month, then one of the networks in the country, let alone the other 3 that exist in that location, want to charge you 30 cents a month in a roaming scenario, it just stops working. So if MNOs can't work out how to start monetizing these technologies, they will start pulling them. And I think, so Cat 1 Biz is certainly something that I talk about a lot, probably because it's just easy from a network perspective, from a sales perspective. It's really simple just to say to someone, yeah, sure, 4G works everywhere, and you've got all this battery saving stuff, and go for it. So the more that the module vendors and the clever people that kind of manage all those battery saving technologies, the more that they can kind of bring those to the fore in technologies like Cat 1 Biz, I think the better for all of us. I've abandoned my clicker. Let's go find it. So, presuming that you guys are kind of hardware people, you're kind of put yourself in the position of a device designer, what do I think that you should focus on? From my perspective, I think what you should be focusing on. So I'll start this bottom right-hand side. Lots of cases I find that people talk about decisions they've already made by the time they come to us. So I'd say don't just focus on price. Don't just focus on that BOM cost when you're looking at a cellular module. I had a case recently where the use case, it was some kind of high volume telematics use case. And they were burning about 3 gigs of data a month, but they were using LTE-M. And I kind of scratched my head and I said to the guy, why are you using LTE-M if you're running that much data? You know, this thing was connected to a mains power source. It didn't need any battery saving. He said because the modules were cheap. And I kind of get that. That kind of makes sense. We also had a customer a while ago who said, oh, I've got all of these 3G modules. Now, 3G didn't take off largely because they were expensive. But obviously, whoever was selling these to this poor guy had seen that the market for 3G modules was pretty much dead, and they needed to ship them. So it's probably some guy with a pallet in his garage just trying to get rid of these things. But at that point, as a device designer or a hardware guy, a lot of the time when we talk to people, that's already been decided. So you're almost kind of backtracking and trying to solve problems that shouldn't be there. So don't just focus on the module cost. What does your application really need? Go back to that example there where these guys didn't really need LTM. So think realistically about what you require and what your expansion plans are. So, I mean, today, fine, you might be doing it in your garage. You might be kind of, I'll go around Europe, but spend some time. I mean, if it only costs you 10 cents more to add a couple of LTE bands or have kind of a global version of a module, just consider how much time and effort that's going to save you later. And then this is really what we've been talking about. Where are these technologies available? And at the moment, you kind of have to have a little bit of a crystal ball. I haven't spooked anyone by saying maybe that narrowband won't exist everywhere forever. But all of these technologies aren't going to be supported alongside each other forever and ever. It's impossible. There will be winners and there will be losers, and some stuff will boom and some stuff will have to go. It's just the reality. So think about those things. And I mean, the core point there really is just take your time. So not a sales pitch, but just an example of how we're solving it. So I can drone on for hours about why it's difficult, but a question about how we're solving it. So from a connectivity provider standpoint, what I would look for is maximum flexibility. Is there something that might happen in the future that will affect your solution? So you should have an ability to update it over the air. So we use multi-IMSI that we nest in an EUICC SGP02, and I know there'll be questions about SGB32 and where we go with that. But ultimately, you want something that you can deploy, and then in the future, worst case, MNOs have an argument, someone pulls narrowband, one network goes out of coverage, something happens that you haven't predicted. You have to maintain that maximum volume of adaptability and flexibility with your carrier. So you don't want to get to a point where you've either got to roll trucks to change SIMs, or you just speak to your connectivity provider and they kind of shrug their shoulders and say, hey, we tried, we can't predict the future. We can't predict the future, but we can have a pretty good go at it. And this is kind of wrapping it up really for me. This doesn't have to be talking to me necessarily, but I would just say, consider, so we've got hardware people, module people, end customers, solution providers, hardware designers, connectivity people, network people. We all just need to talk more. I said before, MNOs don't talk, and we've kind of gotten to this point by not conversing and not making kind of strategic collective decisions. So I'm sure any connectivity provider will tell you the same, but if you have early plans, if you have this kind of idea in your head, there's nothing to stop you phoning up someone like Wireless Logic or whoever else, name any other connectivity provider, and speaking to someone who's kind of from an engineering background that can walk you through it. We could really just look at the globe and someone say, oh, I want to deploy there and there and there. Have you got any advice for me? We talked about permanent roaming before. More of that will come in. You've already got places like Singapore and Indonesia and Malaysia who kind of scratching their heads and thinking, well, maybe we should adopt that kind of model to protect our networks. But the only way to get a really open and honest opinion of that, I think, is to speak to people who do this every day. And that might be me, but that might be any match of other people. So that's my 100% advice. And that's it. And you can contact me if you like. Okay?
Thank you so much.
Oh,
now,
if people ask questions, I can't hear them.
That comes to question time. You should be able to hear them through the speaker. Anyone got any questions? I saw a lot of people nodding heads. I love that some people are taking notes on paper with a pen. Love it. It works, doesn't it? Anyone have any questions that you would like to put as we have a little bit of time left? Here we go.
So I just wanted to check regarding the NTN connectivity.
Feel like a DJ. Go for it.
Yeah, I was just curious regarding the NTN connectivity. How is that going on given that it is being picked up? So I was just curious, does that bring additional complexity, or how is it going to play around in the wireless connectivity space?
What kind of connectivity did you say?
NTN connectivity, non-terrestrial networks.
Yeah, I mean, we're already talking about it. So we have spent a lot of time at Wireless Logic becoming like a Starlink provider. We work closely with the likes of Orbcomm. And I mean, these are supplementary technologies. I guess me from a cellular network, it's for us, the goal is to be involved in the conversation. So if we were just to push customers off to kind of satellite providers, it becomes very difficult for us to be involved in the story. To my point, though, I mean, all of us need to talk more. So those non-terrestrial providers, cellular providers, we just need to hold hands together and understand that, you know, we're not going to win every single customer each from that kind of business perspective, but the only way for the whole industry or for the applications that are being rolled out is for us to work together. And I mean, yeah, it will change. I think those connectivity providers, like cellular connectivity providers that adopt relationships with non-terrestrial networks will be the ones ultimately that will win.
Thank you.
Right at the back here. Just do notice that this QR code is for you to scan and get your CPD credits.
Hi. How do you foresee the future of narrowband IoT and LTE-M because of those costs added by MNOs and MVNOs to access to the networks?
I mean, I would be guessing. I mean, from my personal perspective, I think narrowband's difficult. I think there's such little adoption. I think LTE-M, it probably depends a little bit on, so imagine it's not, so at the moment you've got networks that are 4G networks, and they're kind of upgrading their base stations to support these technologies. We will also go through a process in the coming years where those mobile network operators have to completely upgrade their radio networks and everything to support 5G standalone. And at the same time, some of those technologies will kind of come with it. So, you know, the likes of Nokia and Ericsson will provide those technologies by default. I don't think they'll both continue to exist. Cat 1bis for me is a big winner, and I mean that put my point just then about 5G networks. It's going to take ages. It's going to take another 10 years before you can roam 5G standalone everywhere and use 5G Red Hat. So ultimately, it probably depends on the likes of Nokia and Ericsson and such the like. I think personally that LTE-M and Cat 1bis will be the winners, but I mean, I've placed a few bets in my time and been wrong before. So.